This lecture is going to cover the social changes during the Industrial Revolution and all the major changes that happened between people. So social, we should always review and always understand that means interactions between people, and that's going to be one of our three major things that we're going to focus on for the Industrial Revolution. The most important piece of vocabulary that you have to understand is urbanization. Urbanization is just the process of people moving from rural areas into the cities, so moving from the countryside into the cities and the growth of those cities. A tenement is the multi-story apartment buildings that are very, very substandard. They're very poor living conditions that most of our working class is going to live in. The standard of living, this is the level of material goods that is available to a person. So this is the goods and services that a person can afford and can buy. And this is what determines your standard of living and your lifestyle. Cult of domesticity, we will go over later on. In the Temperance Movement, we also go over, but I wanted to have them on here. Same with women's suffrage. And then social gospel, we will also go over near the end. I forgot social mobility is also very important. This is the ability of an individual to move up and down the social ladder. In the United States, we have quite a bit of social mobility. You can go up social classes or down social classes very, very easily, and that kind of combines with the standard of living. So the first part of the social changes, and like I told you, the most important that we're going to cover is going to be urbanization. Urbanization is probably the biggest change that happens during the Industrial Revolution, because before it, most people lived in the countryside, but after, most people begin to live in cities. So there are three primary causes of the urbanization that occurred during this time period. Is first the agricultural revolution. If you remember back to the last lecture talking about the agricultural revolution, farmers had been put out of work because of the enclosure movement and because of the use of machines, and also just that large population boom made it so that not everybody could have a farm to work. Those people then moved to the cities to find the plentiful jobs in the factories, which is our second point, the rise of the factory system. Obviously, you locate a factory in the city because it has a more concentrated population for work, and the jobs in the factories, even though they seem low by today's standards, were very stable and very high paying for back then. If you got a job in a factory, it was very easy because you would wake up, you'd go to work, even though it was hard work, but you knew you'd be getting a steady paycheck, as opposed to a farmer where if your crops failed one year, your family may starve. The third piece is immigration and migration. So there's that internal rural to urban migration that's happening in countries where people are leaving the countryside and heading into the cities. But there's also the international immigration of push-pull factors. People were migrating from different countries because of overpopulation or war or famine or persecution of their religion, and going to areas that had plentiful jobs and not as many issues. This is really big in the United States, where we see our huge uptick in immigration during the 1800s from Southern and Central and Eastern Europe over to the United States. So these three things combine to cause the city's populations to absolutely explode and urbanization to grow. Some of the initial effects of urbanization are first the just absolutely exponential growth of the cities. The cities quadruple sometimes in population seemingly overnight. There's an initial decrease in the standard of living. City services get really overloaded, so the tenements spring up. Just imagine the worst apartment building you can imagine, and people are crowded into it. There's not enough water. There's not enough air. There's not enough window space. They're just terrible, terrible buildings, but they're cheap. And the farmers, or the former farmers who are moving into the cities, and the immigrants can stay there and live there while they work in the factories. There's pollution, crime. There's an overload of the city services. The cities are not ready to handle the sudden influx of population. So crime, trash, sewage, everything is overloaded, and it takes the cities a while to catch up. There are increased job opportunities. This is mostly for the middle class. So I'll put MC here. the middle class begins to provide services to a lot of the people living in the cities. They open businesses, they open grocery stores, they open repair shops, and that's what allows them to leave the working class and become middle class. Entertainment increases. This is the rise of a lot of our modern entertainment movements. Professional sports are founded, dancing becomes big, theaters, eventually movie theaters, because there's so many people concentrated in one area. There's an increase in the amount of money they have available to them, so they spend it on things for entertainment. So you can see here the tenements in these pictures. I'm putting my mouse over just very bad living conditions, but they are cheap and, well, relatively cheap, and the working class can live in them and have a spot to live in the cities. You can see just the urbanization here, the rise of the factory system. This is actually Cleveland down here at Rockefeller's oil refinery. Eventually, the cities begin to catch up to the problems, and the process of urban renewal begins. And this happens from the late 1890s all the way into the 1900s, and this is where cities improve. Jacob Riis publishes a very, very important book called How the Other Half Lives, and this book is where he went into the tenements and he actually photographed and wrote about the lives of the working class there. And it shocked a lot of middle-class people so much that they began to demand for building codes and hospitals to be built and sewage lines to improve the cities. So cities began to do things like pave their streets, add in gas and electric lights eventually to light up the cities to deal with crime. There were underground sewage systems put in to carry waste away from the cities, and skyscrapers were built because there wasn't enough land to go out anymore, so they built up, and that alleviated a lot of the housing problems. So before we go on, I want to go over the class system and how it changed during the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, we had three main classes evolve, and those are, and I'm just going to abbreviate them, the upper class up here, so the UC, the upper class. These are the people who own the factories, they own the mines, they own the railroads. They've had money for 100 years. They're going to continue to have money. In the middle, we obviously have our middle class, which I'll abbreviate with MC. The way I kind of explain them is they run the factories, they run the railroads, they're like managers, and they also have, and I'll put SB, small businesses. They have small businesses. They have the grocery stores, the repair shops, and a lot of them are people who got out of the working class by owning a small business or by running a factory or being a manager for the upper class. At the bottom, we have the working class, which I will put as WC. The working class work in the factories, so they're in factories. They're the ones who are actually producing the goods. And this is the new class structure, and it's decided on money. That's how you know what class you're in. The richer you are, the higher you go up the class structure. The reason I showed that class structure right before education is education would really decide, our class structure would really decide where you ended up and where your education ended during the Industrial Revolution. So pre-Industrial Revolution, schooling was pretty much private and expensive. Families would pick and choose which kids went to school, and schools were all paid for out of pocket. During the Industrial Revolution, the idea of the public school arises, and this comes from the idea that the new industrialized society needs workers who can do basic skills, and it would also produce better citizens and kind of Americanize and assimilate a lot of the immigrants. In industrial societies, you need your workers to read at a minimum so that they can be able to work in those factories. And that's going to be the main goal. Get the kids to read. They don't have to go to middle school. They don't have to go to high school, but they at least know how to read and they can work in the factories. Furthermore, teachers began to actually receive real training during the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't just somebody who could read who happened to live in your town. They were a trained teacher from a university that would be like Kent State. So during the Industrial Revolution, elementary school becomes mandatory. This is because they wanted to A, have people who could read, and B, it got kids out of the factories so they wouldn't be working in the factories all the time. Secondary schools, which we call high schools, were mostly the middle class. So elementary was everybody, and then the working class kids went to work after elementary, so they didn't move up to the next level of high school. High school is middle class and upper class. Boys would focus on learning skills for the future jobs in industry or business or government, and focus a lot on science or math because that's what the Industrial Revolution required. Girls who would go to high school would have separate classes and would take what we would call a lot of home ec classes, which would prepare them to be mothers and wives. They would learn to read, but not as much focus on math and science. We'll see why this was a thing. The middle class was very focused on women being in the home. Universities, again, they're going to be pretty much upper class, open to some middle class. They focus on science, engineering, math, because that's what an industrial society needs. They need engineers, they need scientists. And some small women's colleges begin to form and to begin to offer girls not just domestic education, but also education in science, math, politics, and government, which would have a very, very big impact on the women's suffrage movement trying to get the right to vote. So we're going to talk about two classes today. We don't talk much about the upper class because they really haven't changed that much. It's still the rich people who owned most of the factories and farms before, owning them during the Industrial Revolution. But the working class is the first one we'll talk about. And these are the people who work in the farms and mines and the factories. They're the lowest of our classes, and they're what's called unskilled labor. Unskilled labor are jobs that don't require specialization. Think jobs like factory work and farm work and mining, where they can pretty much find anyone to do it. They live in the slums and the tenements of the cities in very, very poor conditions, and they also have terrible working conditions. Long hours, we're talking 15 to 16-hour days, low pay, pennies, if not 10, 20 cents a day, in very dangerous conditions. If you look at this iron mill over here, it's dark and probably there wasn't even a lot of light in it. There's a lot of child labor and just very, very dangerous conditions for somebody to be working in. But they formed the majority of the people at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Our next class is the middle class, and this is going to be the class that benefits the most from the Industrial Revolution. They get the most out of it. They are the artisans, the inventors, the people who run the factories, the managers, and they have a very, very good time during the Industrial Revolution because their skills are in demand. So they live in the suburbs around the cities. They don't want to live in the tenements, so they move outside of it into neighborhoods like the one you see on the right. They're educated and they're skilled labor. Skilled labor requires a specialization. So they fix steam engines, they're plumbers, later electricians. And their growth is, like I said, directly tied to industrialization. They provide the services that are needed for an urbanized, industrialized society. The middle class, one of the key things, women do not work. In the working class, women had to work to provide for their families. But in the middle class, women stay at home and they take care of the children instead of working out away from the home. The next idea that we're going to get to, we'll take a break from the social classes, is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is a very charged idea. If it was used to justify a lot of terrible things, and this cartoon kind of demonstrates social Darwinism very well. You have the white children in the back who are reading and being orderly, and these represent the different United States states. And then these children up front and over here represent the United States as colonies and who the United States thinks it has to take care of. And you can see Uncle Sam giving the colonies like a stern talking to because they're the rowdy kids who need some discipline. So Charles Darwin comes up with the idea of evolution, and some people begin to apply it to society. And in Charles Darwin's ideas of evolution, it's that the fittest survive. So if an animal is born with a leg that is, limp, it's going to get eaten, it's not going to survive, and it's not going to pass on its genes. So the more powerful, stronger animals will pass their genes on because they'll survive. People began to apply that to society and human civilization. And what they would say is that the more fit civilization, the stronger one, is going to conquer and rule over the more unfit ones, which is a lot more complicated when you try and apply it to human civilizations. It would eventually be used to justify racism because they would say back then that the white race was stronger and that it was bound to conquer the other races because it had, industrialization and urbanization and modernization. And it would also be used to justify the massive corporations because these corporations were obviously more fit because they survived and they were the strongest ones. This would go on to be used to justify imperialism, which is our next unit, and to continue to push ideas around until eventually it was part of Hitler's ideas of why the Jews and the Slavs should be eliminated in Eastern Europe. If you don't understand social Darwinism, I highly suggest you come talk to me because it is going to come up again and again and again all the way through World War II. Women also played a very important part during the Industrial Revolution. You kind of see down here the two different major social classes we've studied, our working class here and then our middle class women here, and obviously two very different lives. So working class women, they worked. I mean, just like their husbands, just like their children, they had to work outside the home because they had to support their families. They had to pay for their rent and their food, and wages were low. So every single person in the family had to work. You can see here from the tenements, that rent could cost weeks worth of work just to pay for it because there wasn't enough housing. Middle-class women followed what was called the cult of domesticity, and this was the idea that women should do domestic work. They should stay inside the home to take care of children, take care of the religion and the family, and be submissive to their husbands. Their husbands were totally in charge. This is because they didn't want to seem poor. They didn't want to seem like they had to work outside the house like the working class women. If a woman was able to stay home and not have to go out to work, that meant her husband earned enough for her to stay home, and that meant they were middle class or they were upper class. So they try and imitate the upper class as much as they can in their styles of dress, how they talk, how they act, where they send their kids to school, because they don't want to seem poor like the working class. Women were very involved in politics during this time as well, and two of their biggest things they did were the Temperance Movement and the Suffrage Movement. The Temperance Movement was the banning of the sale, transport, and consumption of alcohol, and this is supported a lot by lower to middle income class women because they were on the receiving end a lot of the problems from alcohol back then. They said that by getting rid of alcohol, it would lead to a more and better workforce because people would not be showing up intoxicated on the job, or there wouldn't be as many issues with drinking, and it would end domestic problems because more people would have less families would have issues with alcohol, and it would just create a more efficient and moral society. The other thing women were very involved in was the suffrage movement, and this grows directly out of women gaining more wealth and power in society. So by the late 1800s, a lot of women across the world had gained the right to control their own property and control the ability to get a divorce. And as women began to work more, get their own money, and become more independent, they began to demand the right to vote. It was highly supported by middle-class women who really wanted to push the idea that women were equal to men, and it came from those universities that a lot of those women attended where they were taught math, science, and politics. And eventually, by the 1920s, a lot of women would actually gain the right to vote in Western European and North American countries. So I hope that helps you make some sense of the social changes during the Industrial Revolution. And if you missed the previous lecture on the intro to the Industrial Revolution, you can get it in the right-hand corner here. And the next lecture is in the bottom left-hand corner. And if you have any questions, just let me know.